Jonathan Harounoff joins us on the podcast once again. Last time I talked to him, he was a journalist. He's still a journalist, but he's also held the very prestigious position of Israel's international spokesperson to the United Nations. He also authored a wonderful history of the women life freedom movement in Iran, titled Unveil Inside Iran's Women Life Freedom Revolt. Jonathan, welcome to the show. How are you, man?
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for having me back. Great to be with you.
Yes, and of course, a belated congratulations for your post as international spokesperson for Israel to the United Nations.
Thank you.
So, tell me about what is the most challenging part of your position?
Well, the UN is an institution that was established in the wake of the Second World War in 1945 and after the Holocaust. And the goals of the UN were very commendable, admirable, necessary at the time. The goals were, advancing a peaceful resolution of international disputes, maintaining global stability, and essentially doing everything possible to prevent the outbreak of and perpetuation of further conflicts. And these days, 80 years on, it's extremely disappointing and challenging to see some of its agencies and officials stray from these important peacekeeping goals and become myopically focused on Israel, on isolating it and demonizing it, as opposed to actually taking necessary steps to reach resolution of certain conflicts, namely by pushing for the release of the hostages who were taken more than 21 months ago, and other necessary steps like formally condemning Hamas so that we can actually bring an end to this war that Israel didn't start. And one of the things that Israel's doing, the Israeli mission to the UN is doing uh, all the time is doing whatever is necessary to correct the the narratives and the ingrained biases that have unfortunately come to characterize the UN as of late.
Mhm. Yes, sir. Right. So we're not really focusing on Israel at the moment, but just one more question before we move on to the main topic. What can the United Nations do to stop the war between Israel and her neighbors?
Well, right now, what it's doing is applying a lot of pressure, trying to apply a lot of pressure on Israel, using up a lot of the UN's resources, time, and energies towards, slamming a lot of Israel's actions, but very little is being done to pressure the other side, Hamas, who initiated this conflict and continue to hold 50 Israelis hostage, some dead, some alive. And one of the key things that the UN can do that isn't doing enough is apply pressure on Hamas, not just Israel. Apply pressure on Hamas, condemn them for the terrorist organization that they are, and force them to come to the negotiating table and to release these hostages because the war cannot end while hostages are still in Gaza.
Certainly. Okay. Now, moving on to Iran. I understand that the news broke out of the very brief period of conflict between that country and Israel. What happened and what can we learn from it?
A number of things we can learn. One thing is for certain is that Israel had to act when it did act after years of careful intelligence gathering pointing to this imminent and very existential threat that the Islamic Republic of Iran was posing. And we learned that the Islamic Republic faced a rather humiliating defeat militarily as a result of this 12-day war. And and that since this 12-day war ended, the regime has sort of had to pivot its strategy. Before the war, we saw much of its state issued imagery and slogans and posters in city centers focused on the IRGC's military might, its commanders, and its overwhelming prowess over its adversaries. Now, after this humiliating uh, defeat, we've seen the regime shift its focus to a kind of hollow nationalism to create a sort of rally around the flag effect with the people of Iran, who of course know better. And you've seen good reporting on this emerging phenomenon in outlets like Iran International. But what's been fascinating is that the regime has even resorted to propagating this pre-Islamic imagery and iconography and interspersing it with present-day images uh, to imply that the regime is fighting this civilizational battle on behalf of the Iranian people. But the people, of course, know better. They know what this regime really is and how for the past 46 years they haven't stood by their people, which is why the country and its civilians have repeatedly, you know, initiated these waves of uprisings. We saw it in 1999 with the student protests. We saw it in 2009 with the Green Revolution and the highly controversial presidential re-election of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. We saw it in 2017 and 18 with the economic protests, and in 2022 and 2023 with the Women Life Freedom Movement. And even right before the 12-day war broke out, there was, and it didn't receive the reporting and media attention that it deserved. You saw massive protests underway inside Iran, where thousands of truckers from all over Iran were staging these economic protests. But in answer to your question, in recent months, we've really seen two Islamic republics being presented to the world. The first was an Islamic republic that appeared to want to re-engage with the West, re-enter nuclear negotiations. And if you took what they were saying at face value, it appeared that they did want peace. But the second Islamic republic, which was exposed during Operation Rising Lion, was completely different. And at the same time as talking about wanting peace, it was amassing a massive arsenal of ballistic missiles, destructive missiles, and was continuing to build this nuclear weapons program that was anything but peaceful. And so Israel's tactical victories throughout that conflict were really marked by the achievement of rapid air dominance, high interception rates against indiscriminately fired Iranian missile barrages, and the disruption of Iran's command and control structure. And this was, of course, followed by US's Operation Midnight Hammer, which was an extraordinary operation consisting of approximately 120 aircraft, 7 B-2 Spirit bombers dropping about 14 bunker buster bombs. And that operation alone was described by the US chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dan Kane, as the largest B-2 operational strike in US history. And while Israel's and the US's strikes were highly precise, highly coordinated, and highly effective, the Iranian response, on the other hand, wasn't. The regime fired hundreds of ballistic missiles over civilian population centers, and it caused some damage. It didn't cause as much damage as the regime would have liked because of Israeli civil preparedness and because of its sophisticated defense systems. But still, these ballistic missiles killed some 28 people, and all but one of those were civilians. And it wounded over 3,000 people and caused enormous damage to infrastructure, including hospitals and apartment buildings. So that's a summary of recent conflict.
That's it. Right. I think a common criticism that had been launched around this time was, well, although granted, Iran did uh, attack Israel via its proxies, it did not attack the country directly. While meanwhile, Israel did attack Iranian territory directly. How is this justifiable?
Well, if Israel waited until the Islamic Republic attacked it directly and with the sort of level of destruction that it had planned, it would have been too late by then. Israel could not, the only kind of strike that would have worked was a preemptive one, because reacting to God forbid, a nuclear attack on a tiny country the size of the state of Israel is far too late, which is why this attack was carried out when it was, to prevent such a destructive attack from taking place.
Okay. What are some diplomatic options that both Iran, Israel, and the United States can engage in, to achieve the goal of denuclearization for once, like amongst other things?
Well, I think it's become clear that the Islamic Republic nuclear weapons program isn't a peaceful one, despite its claims that it wants to build this civil nuclear program. So pretty much the only options on the table for the Islamic Republic to sort of return to the negotiating table and to be taken seriously is for it to not have this destructive program and to actually, mean what it says, to allow international agencies into its facilities to monitor these, whether or not it's actually building these programs in secret while telling the world that it's not. But history has shown that negotiating with the Islamic Republic in good faith hasn't yielded positive results. We saw that with the JCPOA, and it's why coming up in October there's a very critical moment. There's a very critical a mechanism that may be reinstituted, the snapback mechanism that can be reinstituted by the Security Council, which is on the 10-year anniversary of the JCPOA negotiations agreement. And if the Islamic Republic, if there isn't a nuclear agreement forged by then, or if there isn't sufficient progress seen that the Islamic Republic is no longer, building this nuclear weapons program or wanting to rebuild it after the 12-day war, then certain Security Council member states have retained the power to reimpose all of the sanctions that had been imposed on the Islamic Republic pre-JCPOA. So the next couple of months are going to be extremely telling in the sort of trajectory that we see the Islamic Republic take, whether it moves barrels towards rearming itself and again posing an existential threat to Israel or not.
And of course, an existential threat to the world too, because any
And of course,
nuclear
yes,
weapon that falls into the hands of, such a dangerous regime. Yeah.
yes, that's something that I think became pretty abundantly clear, and why it appears, why the United States acted when it did. It didn't act, purely in the interest of Israel. It acted because the Islamic Republic poses a very serious strategic threat to the rest of the world, including the United States, and it has shown so by, these fatwas and these assassination attempts at President Trump and other senior U.S. officials, by assassination attempts, actual attempts and violence on US soil, US military bases throughout the Middle East. This isn't just a threat posed to the tiny state of Israel. This is really a global threat that had to be mitigated. And it was very shocking to see at the United Nations that instead of praising and commending the very necessary work carried out by Israel and the United States, many condemned the countries instead of commending them.
I understand. Okay. Well, of course, another thing that should be condemned in the Islamic Republic is its curtailment, so to speak, of legal rights for women. So, give us a brief comparison as to the rights and freedoms of women before the revolutionary regime versus as it stands currently.
Sure. So in the 20th century, broadly, we saw a very seismic shift in the way women were forced to dress and the sorts of rights we had. It was a real 180. For example, in the 1930s, under the Shah Reza Pahlavi, he even banned the hijab and chador and the veil in general in public as part of his modernization attempts, which is the complete opposite of what we see today. He effectively ordered the inverse of today's morality police and instructed his authorities and police to forcibly remove headscarves when they were seen in public. And 50 or so years later, by 1979, 1980, we saw, after the Islamic Revolution and the overthrow of the last Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, we saw a new mandatory dress code instituted, which required all women to wear the hijab. And women very early in post-revolutionary Iran began protesting this compulsory hijab. It wasn't the actual wearing of the hijab that was problematic. Women, some women wanted to wear it, but they wanted the choice in order to do that. And the choice was what was lacking. And we saw on March 8th, 1979, which is International Women's Day every year, we saw thousands of Iranian women march in the streets of Tehran and other city centers to protest these new restrictive laws. But the rights of women and lack thereof didn't just extend to what they wore. And today, and the people and experts that I spoke to in my book and before, they talked about how the Islamic Republic has, for over 4 decades, instituted a very steady campaign of increasingly restricting women's rights in when it comes to marriage, divorce, inheritance, child custody, work, the courts, running for political office, travel, and essentially exploiting their freedoms and their bodies as these tools of domination. So, in answer to your question, there's been a very clear and disturbing shift
Mhm.
um, between pre and post revolutionary Iran.
Certainly. Um, when when Israel and Iran were in their 12 days of conflict, I look over at those photos of Iran before the revolution, and you see like these like female students in the University of Tehran, and they dress almost identical to, say students that you see in a Western university campus. And it astounds me because the revolution changed everything.
It's very astounding. And I think what's equally astounding is that just because of the impact and the sort of grip the Islamic Republic has had over Iran, I think observers forget just how young the Islamic Republic is. It's 46 years old, and that's really a blip in the broader Iranian Persian history and civilization. And I think people forget what Iran pre 1979 actually looked like and how different it was. In those images, they're extremely illuminating. And they're not, many people who may be watching your show remember that time quite vividly of pre and post revolutionary Iran. It's really quite extraordinary.
Right. So when the women life freedom protests were going on, Iran's president is the uh, one Ibrahim Raisi, I believe, and he passed away in the helicopter crash. And he was a very significant figure during, in the wake of the revolution, because the revolution was initiated by the Islamists, of course, but they were also been participated by certain left-wing elements of Iranian politics. And after the revolution, the Islamist wing executed the left-wing elements who contributed to the revolution. And President Raisi at the time, a military commander or a national security officer, he massacred virtually all of them, and that's why he was named the Butcher of Tehran. So, just to put your historian's hat on, what was the conflict between the Islamists and the left-wingers post-revolution?
Sure. Um, I think it's important to touch on the previous thing that you mentioned about the how popular the revolution was in 1979, and that it wasn't, you know, to refute to counter a popular misconception. It's not this wasn't just spearheaded and supported by Islamists and you know Islamic fundamentalists who wanted this to bring about this Islamic Republic. It was really supported by people across the spectrum, including those on the far left as well, and who believed the kind of promises that the founder of the Islamic Republic, Khomeini, had been promising them from while he was in exile. He's promising them all of these freedoms that would come their way once the Shah was overthrown, and that they would really, be entering this prosperous new era for Iran's history. And of course, um, once the revolution happened, very quickly, many of those factions realized that the Islamic Republic that ended up coming about was very different to the one that was promised. And that's why we saw, so many elements on the left and elsewhere and be increasingly persecuted, arrested, executed by figures like Raisi, who sat on the who held very prominent roles in the judiciary and was uh, sentencing a lot of political dissidents to prison and execution. But I think in answer to your question, it was because the reason why you saw this tension between people who were, avid Islamists and supporters of the Islamic Republic and other factions who had supported the Republic early on is because of the difference between what was promised, what people hoped would come about of the Islamic Republic, and what actually ended up emerging. And that was a massive difference that caused this inevitable strife that we continue to see to this day.
Mhm. Right. Earlier in the conversation, you mentioned the morality police who are responsible for the death of Masa Amini. Now,
Yeah.
what is this institution?
Well, the Islamic Republic's morality police has existed in various forms since the 1979 revolution, but the current version, which is known as the Guidance Patrol, has been in place since 2006. And under the Islamic Republic's law of governance, which is based on the regime's strict interpretation of Sharia law, women are required to cover their hair with a hijab and to wear long, loose-fitting clothing to mask their figure. And since 2006, this special, police unit, known as the Morality Police, has been tasked with enforcing these rules. And they've had regular run-ins with Iranian women who have been accused of not obeying these laws. And some of these encounters have been more violent than others. And the most notorious case in recent years that you mentioned, of course, concerned Mahsa Amini, who was the 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian woman who was detained by the morality police on right by Tehran's metro station on September the 13th, 2022. She was stopped by several officers and she was accused of wearing her headscarf inappropriately. She was taken to a police station where she was beaten with a baton severely to the head. She fell into a coma, and 3 days later, on September the 16th, she died. And authorities claim that she had this underlying health condition that caused her death. But her family and those around her strongly denied that, saying she had no pre-existing conditions. Um, and after the Women Life Freedom uprising kicked off, we saw the morality police retreat briefly somewhat. We even saw shoddy reporting in the West that they had been completely disbanded, which wasn't true, because later, a few months afterwards, we saw them re-emerge and continue to harass women, and we saw them even take a step further by around April 2023. We saw them start to deploy surveillance cameras that were used to identify and penalize women who were seen to violate the country's hijab laws. And the way it worked was women who were identified would initially receive a sort of message, a text message, warning them about potential consequences of this flagrant dress violation. And what followed would be harsher consequences and arrests. And businesses were also urged to seriously monitor and inspect women's dress at their place of work. But despite all of this immense crackdown by the morality police, women have continued to flout the regime's tight controls and observe uh, and people, observers, and even reformist publications have really pointed the morality police as one of the particular issues that really highlight the growing gap between the people of Iran and the state, and how they have very competing visions for what kind of Iran they want to live in.
Mhm. Okay. So had Masa Amini been unimpeded in her journey, you know, out being out and about, do you know where her destination would be? Where was she going?
Well, she was visiting Tehran with her relatives. She came from city of Saqqez, which is predominantly Kurdish in the northwest of Iran. And this was a few weeks before she was about to enroll in college. And my understanding and our reporting is that she was an ordinary girl, ordinary woman who was going on a shopping trip, vacation, to visit, and she was doing what a lot of people her age, do, minding her own business, shopping, spending time with family, friends. She wasn't a a political person. She wasn't. She obviously didn't envisage becoming this martyr. She wasn't even taking part in a protest. Um, and I think that's one of the things that really like resonated with a lot of women inside Iran and internationally, that this really could have happened to anyone. And this was just an ordinary person minding her own business who was very brutally um, killed. And and yeah, so this was just an ordinary woman who was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and fell victim to this very brutal morality police.
Right. How would her family and friends describe her?
She was an extremely caring person. I think one of the interesting things is that her family were even very vocal about the fact that she was actually dressed appropriately. And the surveillance footage seems to confirm that she wasn't, she wasn't even she was wearing a headscarf, she was dressed appropriately, and she was just harassed for no reason and accused by the morality police of dressing inappropriately. But she was a very smart, ambitious young woman who had dreams of you know she cared a lot about animals, and she wanted to go into biology and sciences, and someone who really deserved much better than what her fate ended up being.
Mhm. Right. One of the key facts about Masa Amini was that she's of Kurdish origin, and of course the Kurdish people have a rather beleaguered history in not just Iran but the entire Middle East region. So tell me a little bit about the Kurdish population in Iran, from what you know.
Well, they are extremely beleaguered, as you say, and what we saw was that throughout the course of the women life freedom protest movement, some of the greatest epicenters of protest were in the sort of Kurdistan province, Kurdish, predominantly Kurdish parts of Iran. And that's because the Kurdish people have been most one of the most brutalized groups inside Iran. And many of the people that I spoke to for the book were Kurds who had been harassed, beaten, arrested, family members killed, just because of who they were and nothing else. They weren't breaking any laws. They were ordinary civilians. Um, for example, I spoke to a very prolific male Olympian wrestler who uh, who qualified for the Olympics. He he and his family were all Kurdish, and he uh, he was arrested many times. His brothers were arrested. Some of them were even disappeared, and just because of who they were. And he himself was prevented from flying out of Iran to attend the Olympics, um, where he had very high prospects just because of who he was. And this was a recurring theme that we saw, that these people were extremely oppressed, um, and that the regime had been, trying to perpetuate sort of divisions within Iran by claiming that they, had certain agendas that ran counter to the Islamic Republic of Iran. They tried to break away all the time, that they weren't really Iranian. These sort of acts of gradual dehumanization that we saw take place. But again, it was not just restricted to the Kurds. There were other minorities, other groups of people who were particularly oppressed, have been oppressed for the past 46 years. And we saw that really heighten at the time of the Women Life Freedom Movement. We saw uh, singers, actors, musicians, cooks, dancers, athletes, young, just young, ordinary people of all ethnic groups and religious groups really be brutalized by this regime.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned the Iran wrestling program, and from what I've read, it's among the top in the world. Which brings me to this question: what sort of image does the government of the Islamic Republic of Iran wishes to present itself to the world, and how does the death of Masa Amini, well, break that veneer, so to speak?
Well, it's an interesting question, and it can be approached in many ways. I think the way the Islamic Republic has tried to present itself, and I touched on it before, is that it's tried to present itself as a country that is, extremely militarily very powerful, uh, run by, military leaders and clerical leaders who have the Iranian people's best interest at heart. And many of those notions were severely pierced um, during the 12-Day War, where a lot of its command and control military infrastructure was taken out. And that's why we saw this shift to nationalism that I was referring to, um, because they could no longer sort of claim that they had this sort of um, impregnable military infrastructure just because of how vulnerable it became. So they tried to rally the people around the flag and tell them that we're here to defend you when they're clearly not. Um, but I think other ways that they try to present themselves is as a ironically as a very pluralistic and tolerant society. And I think one key um, group that they sort of exploit in that way is Iran's Jewish community. And it may not be known, but Iran still has the second largest Jewish population in the entire Middle East. There are approximately 10,000 or so Jewish people still living in Iran, in Tehran and Isfahan and Shiraz and elsewhere. And um, they're allowed to practice their religion. Um, they're allowed to observe the Sabbath. They have kosher restaurants. They're able to keep their Jewish festivals. Um, they have kosher butcher, uh, and so on and so forth. But they have to obviously align themselves with the regime, and they're not allowed to be Zionists or maintain any real connection with Israel. And before and after the 12-Day War, um, we saw a lot of what we saw was the regime threatened, or was claiming it was appeared to be threatening this Jewish population for the actions of Israel, and it became clear that this population was pretty unsafe. But the reason why they continue to stay in Iran by and seem to be tolerated by the Islamic Republic is because, in a way, they're a good sort of propaganda tool. They're able to be propped up and shown by the Islamic Republic that, we're not anti-Semitic. We have this massive Jewish population. But what they don't mention is that this is a population that is very tightly controlled by the regime, and that even in the wake of the 12-Day War, we saw this mass crackdown and arrests of hundreds of people who were accused of spying on behalf of Israel, and that also included the arrest of dozens of Jewish people who were interrogated, harassed, forced to cut off any connection with relatives abroad, including in Israel. And that's, I think, another kind of image that they try to project, one of strength, one of impregnability, one of fighting and defending the interests of the people of Iran. But time and again, we've seen that the regime doesn't care about the people of Iran, which is why we see the people of Iran continue to rise up and protest against them.
I believe it is a miracle that we outside of Iran know about what happened to Masa Amini. And I think it's, credits to the journalists and the broadcasters who brought this story, outside Iran's border. Because, who knows how many stories of people like hers who
Yeah.
were either cover up or did not last the news cycle, even locally, let alone nationally. So how did the story of Masa Amini transported across the globe?
Yeah, so there isn't a totally free press at all inside Iran. And it really is, you're right. This was one story that really captured the imagination and attention of the world, but who knows how many more of these very similar instances don't get reported on. The way that Massa Amini's situation was reported on was by a number of very brave reporters and journalists inside Iran, and also a network of Iranian journalists and non-Iranian journalists outside of Iran who had been, communicating with people inside Iran and amplifying their messages. So, for example, there were two women who ended up being arrested by the regime, who one of whom got into the hospital where Masa Amini was kept, um, and captured these very striking images of her uh, all bruised up and battered, connected to tubes and everything. And then after she was announced dead, he captured a very poignant image of her relatives hugging each other in the hallways of the hospital, um, sort of mourning the moment of her death. And those images alone were extremely striking. And but what was the way it was amplified was one of the individuals I spoke to is this uh, incredible journalist named Sajad, based in Turkey, an Iranian journalist who didn't face the same kinds of restrictions that reporters inside Iran face, and he was able to sort of share that story with the outside world. And he reposted a couple of the posts that were made inside Iran, and that's where it really blew up. And he's credited with being one of the first, if not the first, journalist to really break the story of Masa Amini's death. And that's really how it was, through social media, through people really amplifying the message. And but you're right, this was one tragic story, but we don't know how many more there have been that have just been totally suppressed in, whether through an internet blackout or just by people inside Iran just being disappeared and their story not being told.
Right. Give us a brief description of, the state of press freedom or lack thereof in the Islamic Republic today.
Well, you can say that there isn't press freedom as long as the news that's being disseminated is sanctioned and pushed out by the Islamic Republic state-run media. There are plenty of news outlets that do that, and we see it also here. We see, for example, when regime officials come to the UN or come to the UN mostly, or to other countries in Europe or in the West, that they have they're able to gather press, and they have sort of this very sanctioned, sanitized uh, press conferences. So as long as it's sanctioned by the regime, there isn't press freedom. But of course, there is a lot of press freedom in what gets pushed out. And if you're seen as a sort of dissident or reporting the reality on the ground, you will get arrested or worse. And you don't even have to say anything that's flagrantly bad or critical. We've even seen a case of a reporter or a journalist and activist who were on Twitter. I write about this in the book. An extraordinary individual who he commented, or he quote tweeted a post made by the current Supreme Leader Khamenei. He posted a picture. The Supreme Leader posted a picture of him posing with Iran's volleyball team, and the caption had some kind of grammatical error. This journalist, activist, quote tweeted the post with just a full stop, a period, and that exploded, went viral inside Iran and abroad, and it got way more attention, engagement than the original post. And this person was arrested for an act of journalism construed as dissident, as going against the regime and criticizing the government. And this was just one extraordinary example of many cases of clamping down on press freedom, and real cases of press freedom if something gets reported on. But that's why the Women Life Freedom movement didn't really have a ton of real journalists on the ground reporting what was going on, and that's why the world really relied on citizen journalists and sort of netizens and the young people using encrypted social media messaging tools to sort of show the world what was actually happening on the ground, just because there is a real lack of press freedom. And if you look at the index showing the countries with the most and the least press freedom, you'll see that the Islamic Republic or Iran is towards the end of that list.
I see. Yeah. That's incredible. Now, from the women life freedom movement, what how can we answer the question, what do Iranian women want?
Did you say what do they want, the Iranian women?
Yes, what do they want?
I mean, I wouldn't just restrict it to what the women of Iran want. I think what vast swathes of the Iranian population want, men, women, children, the young, the old, the elderly, is they want what people everywhere in the world want. They want to live with dignity and respect. They want the freedom to study, to work, to love, to dress how they like. And if that means wearing, religious clothing and headscarves, chadors, they want the option, the ability to choose between whether or not they do that, and not just to be told what they're doing. Um, but I think that's ultimately what they've been demanding since the revolution came into being, and that's why we saw those massive protests right at the beginning of the Islamic Republic's in its infancy. That people just want freedom. They want to be able to live the way they like, and they don't want to be coerced into a lifestyle that they don't want. And and just the most basic sense, that's what they're after, and that's why the women life freedom. That's why the slogan of that uprising was women life freedom. It's a very, in its simplest terms, they want to reclaim their lives and they want freedom.
Mhm. And what did the Islamic Republic regime respond to those very reasonable demands?
Well, to the Islamic Republic, these aren't reasonable demands. They pose a very, a very existential threat to the very foundations and pillars of the Islamic Republic. That, um, the sort of subjugation of women and their lack of rights, and the idea that women have to conform to a certain way of life is very fundamental to the way the Islamic Republic operates. And if women were to stray, according to the regime, suddenly dress differently, that is a massive threat to the very ideals of the Islamic Republic. So they responded, not with compromise, but with unrelenting brutality and oppression, with arrests, with beatings, with disappearances, with killings, and also with very intentional targeting. We saw a lot of women who I spoke to, and that you see on social media as well, who were shot in the eyes intentionally by regime forces, um, and who lost sight in either one or both of their eyes, who had to get emergency medical treatment abroad, um, because they were seen as this existential threat. And I mean, the one of the key takeaways of the Women Life Freedom Uprising is it was one of the greatest threats that the Islamic Republic faced. And it wasn't by a sort of external force, it was by the very people of Iran who had had enough. And this wasn't the first time they rose up, as we've discussed before, but this was one of the largest, most coordinated efforts at destabilizing and uprooting this government that hasn't cared for its people for the past 46 years.
Mhm. And of course, not to mention the many extrajudicial, killings of citizens without a fair trial or even a verdict.
Yeah,
So,
there was a
yeah.
there was a point in time where it was, I believe, it was another athlete whose family I'd been speaking to, and they spoke about these kangaroo trials and these trials where people's fate would be decided within a matter of minutes, where there was a sort of trial, so to speak, but these were sham trials, and the outcome was already a foregone conclusion, and um, yeah.
So does all of these, crackdowns show that the regime is concerned about its own legitimacy?
Um, how do you mean?
In a sense that, the people of Iran no longer views the revolutionary regime as legitimate.
Uh, I think an important qualifier here is that not every person inside the Islamic Republic of Iran doesn't support the regime. There were probably, I think, the rough consensus that around 20 to 25% of the population does still support the regime, perhaps because they're reliant on its survival as government employees or because they're die-hard religious fundamentalists and believe in the Islamic Republic's way of life. But the vast majority, the overwhelming majority of the people inside Iran either strongly don't oppose the regime or would prefer an alternative system of government. And we saw that with even though there isn't, comprehensive polling inside Iran, we saw that with the turnouts of the recent presidential elections, they were historically low. And that was a real indication of just how little faith the people of Iran have in their government. Um, but I do think that it was, the women life freedom protests and the presidential elections and general uprisings are a real indictment on on the regime and what people think of their government. And it was seen as a very serious threat, which is why the regime reacted with a very serious, you know, crackdown, clampdown, arrests of people.
I see. Yeah. And how does the uh, how does the UN's response, or sorry, I should rephrase that. How did the UN, the United Nations, the institutions that you're working in, respond to the death of Masa Amini, the protest movement, and the international response to it?
We saw some response. We saw many, initial expressions of overwhelming support and solidarity with the people, especially the women of Iran, including the UN, different agencies, UN Women and other agencies as well. We also saw in believe it, December um, of shortly after the Women Life Freedom protest kicked off, we saw a very concerted effort at removing the Islamic Republic of Iran from important UN commissions that were focused on women's rights, and that ended up succeeding. So we saw some action be taken by the UN and by its member states at holding the Islamic Republic accountable for its actions. But of course, more could have been done, and not enough was done. We saw a lot of expressions of support, but we didn't see it followed by sufficient action. Um, we saw, condemnations of the Islamic Republic, but we didn't see, sufficient sanctions and attempts at isolating the regime and sort of demonstrating support for the people of Iran that way. So I would say that the international response was initially overwhelmingly supportive, but it wasn't followed by sufficient action,
Mhm.
which is what the people of Iran want. They don't want they don't want outside nations, physically interfering and intervening and sort of bringing about regime changes, as some have noted. That's not what the people of Iran want, and I don't think that's. I think only the people of Iran can decide and dictate their own future. But what they want from the international community is support by not working and collaborating and trading with the Islamic Republic, which helps sustain their machine and helps, would sort of sustain and perpetuate the kind of oppression that people of Iran are facing inside Iran.
Well, what can or has Israel, your home country, um, do or has done to help the women of Iran?
Well, a very interesting trend that we saw is at the right at the beginning of the Women Life Freedom Protest movement, we saw one of the first groups of people to sort of come to the support of the Iranian people, especially in the diaspora, were the people of Israel, and that's, I think, because there were a lot of similarities and parallels that can be drawn. That both the Iranian people and the Israeli people have both suffered tremendously at the hands of the Islamic Republic, whether directly or indirectly. Uh, and we saw the same thing happen with the October 7th terror attacks, where one of the first groups to sort of come to the support of Israelis were Iranians in the diaspora. They attended a lot of the sort of vigils and rallies and waved their pre-1979 flags, and it's a very extraordinary sight to see. Some might think why are there these Iranian people who are supporting Israel and vice versa? And they forget that before 1979, there was a very long and exceptional history of sort of cooperation and uh, and a rich history of collaboration between Israel and Iran. Uh, I personally hope that Iran's millennia-old civilization, its people's rich history, prevails over the 46-year-old Islamic Republic, and that we can return to a period of calm and stability and peace in the region. Even though that seems quite well, Pollyannish now, I want to hope we can return to a time where Israel and Iran um, sort of resume flights between Tel Aviv and Tehran and collaborate on science, academia, agriculture, and all sorts of other technology, other kinds of fields that can really elevate both countries and the region. And let's not forget that Iran was actually the second Muslim majority nation in the world to recognize Israel as a state in 1950, and they followed Turkey's action. So it's not, entirely unrealistic or sort of ahistorical. These things have happened before, and um, I hope we see a kind of future of peace and less of a future of conflict in that region.
Certainly. Yeah. Yeah, I'm always reminded of the biblical example of Emperor Cyrus and how he
Mm.
freed the Jewish people from captivity, and that is the first model of Persian Jewish you know
Yeah, and that's why
country.
there was so much talk before October 7th and since of, even though it was still a way away from it, of sort of a resumption of Cyrus Accords, sort of expansion of the Abraham Accords, but it's very much rooted in what you're saying, that there's a sort of 2,500 year history here of collaboration between these two great people, and hope, I wish to see a future where that kind of collaboration can happen again.
Mhm. Okay. Well, so on that hopeful note, I'd like to ask you one final question. What do you hope the future of Iran itself would look like?
I hope that the people of Iran can get the opportunity to decide themselves what kind of country and ruling government they live under. It's not something that somebody outside of Iran can decide for them. And um, I I hope that there's sufficient leadership inside Iran and outside of Iran that helps herald this new era for the country. But it's not for the people outside Iran to decide. It's for the people of inside Iran to decide, and for the people abroad to help support the people of Iran in their goals.
Okay, on that note, thank you very much, Jonathan Harounoff, for joining the show.
Thank you so much.